Good evening. Tonight's video is not about one killer, one victim, or one tragic mistake. It's about entire families. Families who went to sleep believing they were safe inside their own homes, never knowing that within hours, their lives would be wiped out in acts of unimaginable violence. Tonight, we're diving into two of the most disturbing family massacre cases in recent history. First, we travel to rural Ohio for one of the largest homicide investigations in the state's history, the Rhoden family massacre. 8 members of the Rhoden family were executed across multiple crime scenes in a single night, while some of them slept beside their children. It was organized, calculated, and terrifyingly personal. Entire generations of one family were targeted in what investigators would later describe as a carefully planned annihilation. Then we travel to the quiet mountains of the French Alps, where the wealthy Flactif family vanished without a trace in 2003. At first, it looked like they had simply fled the country. Their car was discovered abandoned near Geneva Airport, and rumors spread quickly throughout the village. Some people believed Xavier Flactif had run from debt and scandal. Others weren't so sympathetic. In fact, many openly admitted they disliked the family. But behind the doors of their luxury chalet, investigators would eventually uncover something horrifying. A crime scene so meticulously cleaned that it took advanced forensic technology to reveal what had really happened inside that home. Both of these cases share something deeply unsettling. The killers weren't strangers lurking in the shadows. They were people fueled by obsession, resentment, control, and hatred that had been building quietly long before the murders ever took place. So tonight, lock the doors, settle in, and let's step into two cases that left entire communities shaken to their core. Because sometimes the most terrifying crimes are the ones that destroy whole families at once. For this case, we travel to a small, tight-knit community about 70 miles east of Cincinnati, the village of Piketon, Ohio. It's home to around 2,000 people, a rural area surrounded by farmland and rugged terrain, where properties are spread out, and neighbors are often separated by long stretches of land. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where routines rarely change, and where a strong sense of community runs through everything. But in April of 2016, that quiet village would become the scene of Ohio's largest mass murder and one of the most complex investigations in the state's history. The case begins at 7:49 a.m. on Friday, April 22nd, when a 911 call comes in from a woman named Bobby Jo Manley.
911. Yes, I need help get the 40. I need you to tell me the address. What's the address?
I think my brother-in-law's dead.
Okay, what's the address?
Give me just a second.
Ma'am, you gotta tell me what's going on.
That morning had started like any other. Bobby would regularly stop by her brother-in-law's trailer to help feed the dogs and chickens. Her brother-in-law, Christopher Rhoden Sr., had recently separated from her sister Dana, but despite that, Bobby had kept up her routine. She still checked in, still helped out, and there was nothing unusual about her being there that morning. But as she stepped out of her car, something immediately felt off. The dogs were outside, which wasn't normal at all. Christopher would usually have them inside, and he'd almost always be up by the time she arrived, ready to let her in. When she reached the door and found it locked, confusion quickly set in. Using her spare key, she let herself inside and was met with complete silence. It was too quiet. As she stepped further in, she noticed something on the floor. Blood. Not just a small amount, but a trail. A drag mark leading through the trailer. With growing dread, she followed it, and what she found inside the bedrooms was something no one should ever have to see. Christopher Rhoden Sr. and his cousin Gary Rhoden were both there, dead.
Did you drive over there?
Yes, I did.
Okay, what's your name?
Mine?
What's your brother-in-law's name?
Chris Rhoden and Gary Rhoden.
Chris and Gary Rhoden? Do you think they're both dead?
I think they're both dead. Looks like someone has beat the fuck out of them.
Is there anybody else in the house?
Not that I know of. The door was locked when we got here, and I went in, and they're laying on the floor.
Okay. I need you to get out of the house and wait.
I'm done out. I'm
Okay?
standing outside right now.
Okay, just stay out of the house. Don't let anybody go in there.
Shaken and struggling to process what she had just discovered, Bobby ended the call and ran to another nearby trailer, just a short distance away. This one belonged to Christopher and Dana's son, 20-year-old Clarence Frankie Rhoden Jr., who lived there with his fiancée Hannah Gilly, their 6-month-old baby Ruger, and Frankie's young son Brentley, who often stayed with them. When Bobby knocked on the door, it was opened by 3-year-old Brentley. He seemed confused, almost dazed, and told her something that immediately sent a chill through her. He said his dad looked like a zombie, and that when he tried to wake him, his arm had simply dropped back down. Bobby rushed inside, and the scene she walked into was devastating. Frankie and Hannah were both in bed, lifeless, with blood soaking through the sheets and onto the floor, and beside them, their baby boy Ruger was still alive, sitting near his father, patting his chest, covered in blood. Somehow, despite everything, both Ruger and Brentley were physically unharmed. In the space of just a few minutes, Bobby had discovered multiple members of her family gone, and the situation was quickly spiraling into something far bigger than anyone could have imagined. Around the same time, Bobby and Dana's brother James went to check on Dana at her trailer, which was also nearby on the same stretch of land. When he entered, he found his sister dead. As he moved through the home, he discovered more victims, 19-year-old Hannah Rhoden and 16-year-old Christopher Jr., both in their beds, both shot. Hannah had been lying beside her newborn baby, just 4 days old, and incredibly, that baby Kylie was still alive and unharmed. Within minutes, 7 people had been found dead across the properties and 4 young children were left without parents. As emergency services rushed to the scene, the quiet village of Piketon was suddenly filled with sirens, flashing lights, and a growing sense of fear. But the tragedy didn't end there. A few hours later, another call came in from several miles away. A man named Donald Stone, after hearing the news, decided to check on his cousin Kenneth Rhoden, Christopher Sr.'s brother.
911, can I help you?
Yeah, I need a deputy to come out to close to.
Okay.
It's all this stuff. It's on the news. I just found.
Kenneth was found dead as well, shot in the head, with cash scattered around him.
There are breaking developments in the massacre in Pike County we've been telling you about all day. Just moments ago, Ohio Attorney General Mike DeWine said an 8th shooting victim had been found. That shooting scene is near the border with Adams County. Police are investigating at least 3 different locations on or near Union Hill Road, which is northeast of Peebles. Chopper 9 was over the area at noon today as the investigation was underway. At least 2 of the victims, we're told, are juveniles, and at least 7 of those victims are believed to be members of the same family. That is according to comments by Attorney General Mike DeWine. He made those to 700 WLW. It is not known if the gunman is among the dead.
At that point, the full scale of the situation became clear. 8 victims had been found across 4 separate crime scenes, all within close proximity. Each had been shot, some multiple times, in what appeared to be a calculated and deliberate attack. The victims included Christopher Rhoden Sr., his ex-wife Dana, their children Hannah, Christopher Jr., and Frankie, Frankie's fiancée Hannah Gilly, Christopher Sr.'s cousin Gary, and his brother Kenneth. Meanwhile, the children, newborn Kylie, 6-month-old Ruger, and 3-year-old Brentley, were taken into protective custody, all physically unharmed. Another young child, Sophia, had not been present at the time and was also safe.
Investigators worked through the night, gathering clues about the killings of 8 members of the Rhoden family. One of 4 properties turned crime scene in Pike County. Most of the victims shot as they lay in bed, one with her 4-day-old baby nearby. That infant is one of 3 young children to survive the massacre.
That's out of my realm of thinking that anyone could do that. How heartless.
A $25,000 reward's now being offered as the small town of Piketon remains on edge.
And I'm thinking, what else will happen in our community? What's going on?
The Rhoden family were well known in the community. Christopher Sr. was described as hardworking, and dependable, a man who had spent his life in construction. Dana, a nursing assistant, was known for her love of gardening, baking, and her involvement in the local church. Frankie had been building a future for himself, working in welding and focusing on his young family, while Hannah Gilly dreamed of raising a large, happy household. Each victim had their own story, their own plans, and their own place within that community. As news spread beyond Piketon, attention quickly turned to the investigation. Police warned that they could not confirm whether a suspect was still at large, and if so, that person would be considered armed and dangerous. Looking at the crime scenes, investigators began to piece together what had happened. This was not a random act of violence. It was controlled, methodical, and carried out with precision. It appeared that Christopher Sr. and Gary had been the first targets, likely killed around midnight before the attackers moved from one location to another. There were no clear signs of forced entry, no reports of loud disturbances, and no witnesses who had seen or heard anything unusual. Despite 4 separate crime scenes, everything had happened within a relatively small area, and yet no one had noticed. As investigators searched the properties, they uncovered large marijuana grow operations at 3 of the locations, with thousands of plants found, including one site with around 2,000. Combined with the cache discovered near Kenneth, this initially led police to consider whether the murders could be linked to cartel activity. However, that theory quickly began to fall apart. The level of familiarity required to move between the properties so easily suggested that whoever carried this out knew the family well. They knew the layout, the routines, and how to move without drawing attention. Even the dogs had not reacted, which further suggested that the killers were not strangers. Evidence at the scenes also pointed to more than one attacker. Multiple shell casings, different calibers, and varying shoe prints indicated that several people had been involved. Despite the fear spreading through the community, investigators were becoming more certain of one thing: this was not random. This was personal.
Sheriff Charles Reeder believes the Rhodens were specifically targeted, and he's warning other family members to be on guard.
I cautioned them that they were a target, and I told them to be armed.
Both Reeder and DeWine believe the community isn't at risk, but is asking for community members to be vigilant.
It is in the interest of the people of the state of Ohio that we find this murderer or these murderers as quick as we can.
In the days that followed, the victims were laid to rest, with hundreds from the community coming together in grief. But even as Piketon tried to process what had happened, the investigation continued to grow in scale. Over 800 tips were called in, and more than 400 interviews were conducted, yet no arrests were made. For a small-town department, the case was overwhelming. The resources required, the complexity of the crime, and the pressure to find answers were unlike anything they had ever faced before. And as the weeks turned into months, the question still remained: who could have done this, and why? Despite everything that had happened over that weekend, there were still people in the community who quietly believed this case might never be solved. As April 2017 came around, it marked 1 full year since the murders, a year with no arrests, no clear answers, and very little information being released to the public. Frustration began to grow. Petitions started circulating, with many calling for the FBI to step in, believing the case had become far too big for local authorities to handle alone. But behind the scenes, investigators were walking a very careful line. They knew the people responsible were likely watching the news, following every update, and possibly even living among them. Releasing too much information could jeopardize everything. So while it may have seemed quiet on the outside, the investigation was still very much active. Detectives had already executed dozens of search warrants, and one area in particular began to draw attention: a 27-acre farm in Peebles, Ohio. Several tips had pointed them in that direction. Although the property had been sold a couple of months earlier, it had once belonged to a man named Edward Jake Wagner. Jake wasn't just a random name. He was the father of Sophia and the ex-boyfriend of Hannah Rhoden.
Details are emerging in the weekend property searches connected to the Rhoden family murders in Pike County. The owner of one of the properties tells the 9 on Your Side I-Team that investigators showed up at his house because of the ex-boyfriend of one of the victims.
You see on some Chopper 9 footage from last Friday that detectives searching through several trailers on property where a business called Unlimited Motors is located. I spoke with the property owner today who said the trailers and all that stuff belongs to a guy named Jake Wagner and his family. He says the Wagners dropped off the trailers about 10 days ago and he was supposed to store it for them temporarily.
That connection alone was enough to raise questions. Police were already aware that Jake and Hannah had been involved in ongoing disputes over custody of their daughter. And as they began to look closer, it became harder to ignore one detail. Sophia had not been present at any of the homes on the night of the murders. Was that just a coincidence? Or something far more deliberate? At this stage, investigators had not publicly named the Wagner family as suspects, or even persons of interest. But in a small town like Piketon, where news travels fast and rumors travel faster, people had already begun to talk. The Wagner name carried weight. They were known as a powerful and wealthy family in the area. Jake's grandmother, Frederica Wagner, owned more than 1,700 acres of land in Pike County, with an estimated value of over $4 million, an enormous amount, especially for that region. The family itself was described as extremely tight-knit, protective of one another, and not particularly welcoming to outsiders. Then, not long after the murders, something else raised eyebrows. Jake's immediate family, his father Billy, his mother Angela, and his brother George, suddenly moved over 4,000 miles away to Alaska. They took Sophia with them. At the time, they claimed they were fleeing death threats and trying to escape the rumors spreading throughout the town, but for many, it only added to the suspicion. As 2017 passed into 2018, it still appeared on the surface as though little progress had been made. But in reality, investigators had been quietly building their case piece by piece. And by the end of 2018, everything changed. A Pike County grand jury indicted 6 individuals in connection with the murders. Angela Wagner, her husband, George Wagner III, known as Billy, their 2 sons, George Wagner IV and Jake Wagner. All 4 were arrested and charged with aggravated murder, along with multiple additional charges. 2 more arrests followed. Angela's mother, Rita Newcomb, and Billy's mother, Frederica Wagner, both accused of helping to cover up the crimes. After more than 2 years, the case finally had suspects.
Members of one family conspired, planned, carried out, and then allegedly covered up their violent act to wipe out members of another family. They did this quickly, coldly, calmly, and very carefully, but not carefully enough.
As investigators began revealing what they had uncovered, a disturbing picture started to form. Jake Wagner had met Hannah Rhoden when she was just 13 years old. He was almost 20 at the time, and over the years, the relationship became increasingly concerning. Hannah was said to be completely infatuated with him, eventually moving in with the Wagner family. They even got matching tattoos on their ring fingers, telling people they were as good as married. By the time Hannah was 15, she was pregnant with Sophia. But what followed was not a normal relationship. Jake became increasingly controlling, especially when it came to their daughter. He dictated what Hannah could eat, where she could go, who she could see. His behavior grew more obsessive, more restrictive, until eventually Hannah reached her limit. And so, she left, moving back in with her mother Dana. But with Sophia now in the middle of everything, the connection between the 2 families couldn't be severed, and the tension only escalated. Jake became fixated on gaining full custody. He would secretly record conversations, hoping to catch Hannah saying something that could be used against her in court, but nothing ever worked in his favor. One message he sent to Hannah read, "I done told you she is living with me now. You can live with us or not, that's your choice." Hannah pushed back. She made it clear she wasn't going to give up her daughter. Jake's response only escalated further. He told her that if she didn't comply, he would take Sophia, even by force if necessary. And then things became even more complicated. Hannah became pregnant again. This time, the baby was not Jake's. The father was Charlie Gilly, the brother of Hannah Gilly, who was engaged to Frankie Rhoden. The families were already intertwined, and this only deepened the situation. But Jake refused to accept it. He demanded that Hannah put his surname on the baby's birth certificate. despite DNA proving the child was not his. When she refused, his reaction became even more extreme. He attempted to claim visitation rights, arguing that because the baby would be Sophia's sibling, he had a right to be involved. He even went as far as accusing Hannah's partner of sexually assaulting Sophia, a claim that deeply unsettled everyone involved. But Hannah stood her ground. She was living back with her mother now, trying to rebuild her life, and she made it clear she wanted a fresh start without him. Just weeks before the murders, Jake presented her with custody papers that appeared to have been signed and approved. They weren't. They had been forged by his mother, Angela. Hannah immediately saw through it and refused to sign anything. She made it clear this was over. And in a chilling post made through her mother's Facebook account, she wrote, "I won't sign papers ever. It won't happen. They will have to kill me first." At the time, it may have seemed like an emotional statement, but looking back, it would take on a much darker meaning. As investigators continued digging, they uncovered evidence suggesting that the plan to kill the Rhoden family had been in motion for some time. This hadn't been impulsive, it had been carefully planned. The Wagners had studied the family's routines, their movements, their work schedules, even when the dogs were walked. Security cameras on the properties had been tampered with in the days leading up to the murders. Searches of multiple properties and vehicles uncovered shell casings that matched those found at the crime scenes, along with shoes that matched the prints left behind. Investigators were even able to trace those shoes back to a purchase made by Angela Wagner at a Walmart just one day before the killings. Further searches revealed parts used to make gun silencers, along with 20 bags of concrete mix. Police later discovered that weapons had been buried using that concrete and hidden in a structure near a lake. They also found what was believed to be a $630 cell phone jammer, a device that could prevent calls from being made, ensuring no one could contact emergency services during the attack. Financial records painted an even darker picture. The family's income extended far beyond farming, with evidence suggesting insurance fraud involving the deliberate burning of their own properties and vehicles. Piece by piece, investigators began to understand what they were dealing with. This wasn't just a family dispute. This was something far more calculated. By all accounts, the Wagner family operated with a level of organization that resembled a criminal enterprise, and crossing them came with consequences. As investigators continued to piece everything together, a clearer picture of the Wagner family began to emerge, and it was deeply unsettling. This was not a typical family dynamic. Their loyalty to one another was absolute, almost unbreakable, and every decision, no matter how small, was made together. Nothing was individual. Everything was discussed, agreed upon, and carried out as a unit. At the center of it all was Angela Wagner. She was the matriarch, the one who held everything together, and according to those who had been close to the family, the one who ultimately called the shots. Her devotion to her sons, Jake and George, went far beyond what most would consider normal. She was fiercely protective, deeply controlling, and heavily involved in every aspect of their lives. Even while living in Alaska, that dynamic never changed. Jake had married a woman named Beth Ann, but the marriage was short-lived and deeply troubling. Beth Ann later said she feared for her life during their brief time together. She described how from the very beginning, things felt rushed and controlled. She had made it clear that she wanted to wait before becoming intimate, but she said Jake and his family pushed the relationship forward quickly, insisting on marriage, and in her words, ensuring that intimacy happened the very night of the wedding. What disturbed her even more was the relationship between Angela and her sons, particularly Jake. Beth Ann said that the first time she met them, she genuinely thought Angela and Jake were a couple. That was how close and how intense their dynamic appeared. She wasn't the only one to notice it. George's ex-wife, Tabitha, described the Wagner family as having a kind of pact mentality, a tightly controlled unit where Angela was clearly in charge. The family kept themselves isolated, and anyone who entered their world quickly found themselves cut off from their own support systems. Friends, family, outside influence, all slowly removed. Tabitha said she saw this pattern play out when Hannah first began spending time with Jake at just 13 years old. Even then, something didn't feel right. and she became concerned for both Hannah and the future of her child, Sophia. Tabitha herself had married George straight out of high school, and she described a life that became increasingly controlled. She was isolated from her family, discouraged from leaving the Wagner home, and even had aspects of her personal life dictated, including what she and George were allowed to do within their marriage, based on Angela's beliefs. Angela, by all accounts, was involved in everything. After Tabitha and George had their son, Bullvine, Tabitha tried to convince George to leave the family home and start their own life, but he refused. The control ran too deep. Eventually, in November 2014, things escalated to a breaking point. Tabitha said George became physically violent, beating her with a belt, while Angela allegedly attacked her with a piece of wood and threatened to shoot her. That was the moment she knew she had to leave. As soon as she could, Tabitha fled on her bike, making her way to a nearby gas station where she called her mother for help. But even after she escaped, the control didn't end. Angela began making accusations, serious, unfounded claims against both Tabitha and Beth Ann. At one point, she accused Beth Ann of inappropriate behavior toward Sophia and even claimed she had tried to poison the children. George retained custody of Bullvine and initially blocked Tabitha from seeing her own son. Although they eventually agreed to a shared custody arrangement, Tabitha said George rarely followed through. And when the family moved to Alaska, she wasn't even told. Her son was simply taken. Meanwhile, Jake continued to fully believe everything his mother said. Beth Ann later recalled how he threatened her in terrifying detail, telling her he would hang her in the barn, beat her with a bat, and then burn the barn down. And chillingly, he told her that if he didn't go through with it, his parents would. The day she finally escaped, Beth Ann said she changed her clothes inside a Walmart, slipped out through the back, and left with nothing but the clothes she was wearing. A friend helped her flee the state. As investigators gathered these accounts, alongside the mounting physical evidence, the motive behind the Rhoden murders became clearer. This wasn't just about Sophia, it was about control. Control over children, over relationships, over anyone who stood in their way. By this point, police had uncovered the weapons, the matching shoe prints, the receipts, and the tools used to carry out the crime. When they reconstructed the timeline, it painted a chillingly organized sequence of events. Sophia had not originally been meant to be with Jake that day. It had been a last-minute decision. Hannah, exhausted with a newborn baby just 4 days old, had allowed Sophia to go with her father. Everything else had already been planned. The silencers had been made, the new shoes had been purchased, the routines of the family had been studied in detail. Sometime after 10 p.m., Billy, George, and Jake left their home. Angela remained behind with the children. The three men went first to Christopher Rhoden Sr.'s trailer, where they shot him and Gary. From there, they moved quickly to the next trailer, killing Frankie and Hannah Gilly as they slept. They then continued to Dana's trailer, where Dana, Hannah, and Christopher Jr. were all murdered in their beds. Finally, they drove to Kenneth's home, around 10 minutes away, where he too was shot and killed. Once it was over, they returned home. The weapons were placed into concrete, sealed, and hidden in a structure near one of their lakes, carefully concealed, as though they had prepared for this moment long before it ever happened. For investigators, there was little doubt left. This had been planned, methodical, deliberate, and while it was difficult to say with absolute certainty who initiated the plan, many believed Angela had been the driving force behind it, deeply involved in her sons' lives, their relationships, and ultimately, their decisions. In the end, Angela, Billy, George, and Jake Wagner were all indicted by a grand jury on multiple counts, including aggravated murder and forgery related to custody documents, more than 20 charges each.
Well, the first of 4 family members charged with killing 8 members of another Ohio family has pleaded not guilty to aggravated murder.
A second member of Pike County's Wagner family has pled not guilty.
Not guilty was the plea Tuesday from Billy Wagner here in Pike County Common Pleas Court.
Angela Wagner says she's innocent.
All 4 members of the Wagner family were held without bond, and each of them initially pleaded not guilty. Prosecutors made it clear from the beginning that they intended to seek the death penalty. And across the small community of Piketon, people were divided. Some said they weren't surprised, that something about the family had always felt off. Others refused to believe it, convinced there had to be some kind of mistake. What made it even harder to process was the fact that Jake, Billy, and George had attended the victims' funerals. They stood alongside grieving relatives, blending into the crowd, mourning with the very people whose lives had just been torn apart. As the case developed, some charges began to shift. Billy Wagner's mother, Frederica, had her charges dismissed, while Angela's mother, Rita Newcomb, eventually pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of obstructing official business. In exchange, more serious charges like forgery and perjury were dropped. She later said she felt compelled to tell the truth, describing guilt that weighed on her conscience. Then, on the 5th anniversary of the murders, everything changed. Jake Wagner, the man at the center of it all, stood in court and changed his plea to guilty. He accepted responsibility for multiple charges, including aggravated murder, conspiracy, burglary, tampering with evidence, and unlawful sexual conduct with a minor, relating to his relationship with Hannah when she was just 13 years old. In return, the death penalty was taken off the table, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Even then, his behavior in court was unsettling. At times, he smirked, even laughed. When he spoke, he apologized, but in the same breath claimed he had felt he had no choice. He blamed Hannah, accusing her of being neglectful, repeating disturbing and unproven allegations about her and those around her, patterns of accusation that had followed him throughout his relationships. Jake admitted to personally killing 5 of the 8 victims: Dana, Hannah Rhoden, Christopher Jr., Frankie, and Hannah Gilly. He said his father, Billy, was responsible for killing Christopher Sr., Kenneth, and Gary. As for his brother George, Jake claimed he had fired a single shot that missed and then froze, unable to go through with it. As part of his plea deal, Jake agreed to testify against the rest of his family, his mother, his father, and his brother. Not long after, Angela Wagner also changed her plea. She admitted to conspiracy to commit aggravated murder and was sentenced to a minimum of 30 years in prison with no chance of early release. The woman described as the driving force behind the family now faced decades behind bars. Jake had secured his sentence. Angela had followed. But George chose to fight. In 2022, his trial began. Despite not firing any of the fatal shots, something even Jake confirmed, George pleaded not guilty. He claimed he had gone to bed around 10 p.m. that night, unaware of what was about to happen. But the evidence told a very different story. Investigators walked the jury through the crime scenes in painstaking detail. Blood patterns, bullet trajectories, shoe prints, the movement of bodies. It painted a picture not of someone absent, but of someone present, aware, and complicit. Witness after witness took the stand. Some spoke openly. Others had parts of their testimony withheld out of fear. Fear of a family that even now still carried a reputation for intimidation and control. Former partners of the Wagner men described a deeply disturbing environment behind closed doors. Isolation, control, threats, violence. A family structure where loyalty was everything, and stepping out of line came at a cost. George eventually took the stand in his own defense. He insisted he had no idea what his family had planned, that he believed they were capable of theft, maybe, but not murder. But when pressed, his timeline didn't hold up. The window he described simply didn't match the known sequence of events. After just 8 hours of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict. Guilty. On all counts, George Wagner IV was sentenced to 8 consecutive life sentences, plus an additional 121 years, with no possibility of parole. And still, the story doesn't end there. Billy Wagner, the father, continues to plead not guilty. His trial has faced multiple delays, with new evidence still being processed, and proceedings pushed further into the future. For the victims' families, it's another painful wait, another extension of a nightmare that has already stretched across years. Nearly a decade on, the impact of what happened in Pike County is still being felt. The survivors carry it every single day. Frankie's son, Brentley, who was just 3 years old at the time, later spoke about the fear that has stayed with him. The knowledge that while he slept, people entered his home and took everything from him. That kind of fear doesn't fade easily, if it fades at all. And for the families left behind, the grief is constant. One relative described how a child was made an orphan overnight, how the pain is something they will never truly escape. Questions that should never have needed answering, now part of everyday life. 8 lives were taken. 4 children were left without parents, and an entire community was changed forever. There are cases that shock, and then there are cases like this. Planned, personal, ruthless. Not by strangers passing through, but by people who were known, trusted, and welcomed. In April of 2003, an entire family vanished from their home in the French Alps. No warning, no goodbye. One moment they were there, and the next, they were simply gone. At first, it didn't look like a crime. There were no signs of forced entry, no frantic calls for help, and no obvious evidence of violence. Their chalet sat quietly overlooking the alpine village of Le Grand Bornand, as though the family had simply stepped out and never returned. But as the days passed, something about the disappearance began to feel wrong. And strangely, the town didn't react the way you might expect. People weren't openly grieving, they were whispering. Some residents admitted they disliked the family. Others went even further, describing Xavier Flactif as arrogant, manipulative, and impossible to trust. Rumors spread quickly through the village cafes and ski shops, and before long, the story took on a darker tone. Because when a family disappears without a trace, people usually ask who would do something like this. But in Le Grand Bornand, many people seem to be asking something else entirely. What if someone finally snapped? Then, nearly 5 months later, 150 days after the family vanished, the horrifying truth finally emerged. The Flactif family hadn't run away. They had been murdered. Their burned bodies were eventually discovered buried near a remote mountain chalet, hidden beneath layers of ash and debris, deep in the alpine landscape. What had begun as a missing persons case suddenly became one of the most disturbing murder investigations France had seen in years. And at the center of it all was a man named Xavier Flactif. Before we dive into the investigation itself, it's important to understand who the Flactifs really were, because behind the rumors and headlines was still a real family, a husband, a wife, 3 children. And whatever people thought about Xavier, those children did not deserve what happened to them. 41-year-old Xavier Flactif was originally from northern France, but in 1999 he moved his family to Le Grand Bornand with ambitious plans and expensive taste. He was a property developer who specialized in buying land in the mountains, building luxury ski chalets, and selling them to wealthy British and Dutch investors looking for an alpine escape. And for a while, the business worked incredibly well. Xavier lived loudly and unapologetically. He loved expensive cars, motorcycles, designer clothes, and the image of success. His large blonde wood chalet overlooked much of the village, almost like a symbol of everything he had built. He was charismatic, energetic, and impossible to ignore, the kind of person who entered a room and instantly took control of it. But underneath that polished exterior, problems were beginning to grow. Xavier had developed a reputation in the area, and not always a good one. Rivals accused him of driving up property prices. Former employees claimed he had failed to pay them properly. Others believed he was charming on the surface, but ruthless underneath, and there was truth to some of those accusations. In 1998, Xavier had been convicted of tax fraud and banned from running a business for 10 years. To work around the restriction, many of his financial dealings were placed in his wife's name instead. But despite all of that, those closest to the family described a very different side of him at home. His wife, 36-year-old Ghislaine, was quieter and far more private than Xavier. Warm, nurturing, and deeply devoted to her children, she balanced out his larger-than-life personality. Together, they had built a blended family. Ghislaine already had a teenage son named Mario from a previous relationship, and with Xavier she had 3 more children. 10-year-old Sarah was thoughtful, intelligent, and creative, a girl who loved reading and drawing and was well-liked at school. 9-year-old Letitia was the athlete of the family, an exceptionally talented skier who had already won local competitions and impressed coaches with her natural ability on the slopes. And 7-year-old Gregory was the quietest of the three, gentle, affectionate, and happiest when he was close to his mother. From the outside, the Flactif seemed to embody the Alpine dream. Luxury chalet, successful business, beautiful mountain surroundings, a family building a life in paradise. But behind closed doors, things were beginning to unravel. Xavier's business empire was collapsing under enormous financial pressure. He reportedly owed close to 3 million euros, and one of his largest development projects had recently been denied planning permission, despite the fact that investors had already paid money into it. The debts were mounting, lawsuits were closing in, and Xavier's list of enemies was growing longer by the day. Then, on April 11th, 2003, everything changed. When police first arrived at the Flactif chalet on April 13th, 2003, the investigation didn't begin as a homicide case. At that point, it was still being treated as a routine missing persons investigation. The family's red Toyota Land Cruiser was gone, and Xavier Flactif was known locally for his reckless driving along the narrow mountain roads surrounding the village. To investigators, the most obvious explanation was that the family had somehow crashed somewhere in the Alps. Helicopters searched the winding roads from above, while ground teams combed through forests, ravines, and icy embankments below. But hour after hour they found nothing, no wreckage, no skid marks, no sign of the bright red SUV anywhere. As the days passed, investigators slowly shifted their focus back toward the chalet itself. 10 days after the family vanished, police returned to conduct a second, more detailed search of the home, and that's when things began to feel wrong. Items that officers distinctly remembered seeing during the initial walkthrough had suddenly disappeared. 2 laptops that had previously been sitting open inside the house were now gone. So were several mobile phones. A file containing legal paperwork and property documents had vanished too. Someone had been inside the chalet after police had already searched it. And whoever entered knew exactly what they were looking for. At the same time, investigators began digging deeper into Xavier's financial history, and what they uncovered painted a troubling picture. Xavier wasn't simply struggling financially, he was drowning. Police discovered more than 70 bank accounts, many of them opened in his wife Ghislaine's name, in an apparent attempt to work around the business restrictions imposed after his fraud conviction. Lawsuits from furious investors were piling up, debts were spiraling, and one of his biggest development projects had recently been denied planning approval, despite money already being collected from buyers. By early May, the theory surrounding the family's disappearance had changed completely. Investigators no longer believed the Flactifs had crashed. Now they believed they had fled. Then came another major development, roughly 50 kilometers away, across the Swiss border. The missing Toyota Land Cruiser was discovered abandoned, inside a multi-story parking garage at Geneva Airport. To many, it looked like proof of an escape plan. Drive into Switzerland, abandon the vehicle, disappear. The media seized on the story almost immediately. French news outlets portrayed Xavier as a charming fraudster who had finally run out of road, a man who had vanished to avoid creditors and legal disaster. Television crews flooded the quiet Alpine village, interviewing neighbors, former employees, and business rivals. And while some people expressed concern for the family, others seemed strangely bitter. Some openly admitted they disliked Xavier. Some even appeared to resent him. But one person refused to believe the narrative that the family had simply run away. Mario Blanc, Ghislaine's teenage son from a previous relationship, insisted something terrible had happened. His mother called him every single day, he said. No matter what was going on in her life, she would never have disappeared without warning him. She would have found a way to explain, to say goodbye. And Mario never stopped repeating the same thing. Something was wrong. May 23rd, more than a month after the family vanished, police launched a third and far more exhaustive search of the chalet. This time, forensic specialists accompanied investigators, moving methodically through the home, inch by inch, photographing, swabbing, collecting, and slowly they began uncovering details that earlier searches had missed. Inside the children's bedrooms, lodged deep between gaps in the floorboards, investigators discovered tiny white fragments that initially resembled splintered porcelain or shards of thin glass. But laboratory analysis revealed something far more disturbing. The fragments were tooth enamel, microscopic pieces of children's teeth. Elsewhere in the chalet, beneath a curtain in the living room, investigators recovered a single spent 6.35mm shell casing. There were no obvious bullet holes in the walls and no visible signs of gunfire, but someone had discharged a weapon inside that house. Then investigators noticed something else. On one of the staircases, a section of carpet had been carefully cut away and removed, a perfect square, almost as though someone had deliberately taken part of the crime scene with them. By now, forensic teams also realized the chalet had been cleaned extensively. Floors had been scrubbed, surfaces wiped down, and entire rooms sanitized with remarkable care. But even after all that cleaning, tiny brown flecks remained embedded in cracks in the wood and along the floorboards. Possible traces of blood. The picture was becoming impossible to ignore. This was not the home of a family who had voluntarily disappeared. This was a crime scene. The following day, investigators brought in a specialist forensic unit equipped with a relatively new substance called Blue Star, a luminol-based chemical spray capable of revealing blood that had been scrubbed away, diluted, or cleaned almost beyond detection. Once sprayed onto a surface, the chemical reacts with iron in the blood and glows bright blue in darkness. Investigators moved through the chalet room by room, spraying walls, floors, furniture, and staircases before finally switching off the lights. And suddenly, the house lit up. The kitchen glowed blue. So did sections of the walls, the floors, the tables, the children's bedrooms. Investigators could see blood patterns everywhere, along with drag marks leading toward the basement stairs. The beautiful alpine chalet overlooking the mountains had become the site of unimaginable violence, and whoever committed it had gone to extraordinary lengths to erase every trace. At that moment, the case officially stopped being a disappearance investigation. It became a murder inquiry. Forensic analysts worked around the clock, processing more than 1,000 pieces of evidence collected from the chalet. Every room, every surface, every trace recovered from the house was cataloged and sent for testing. When the DNA results finally came back, they confirmed investigators' worst fears. Blood belonging to all 5 members of the Flactif family had been found inside the chalet: Xavier, Ghislaine, Sarah, Letitia, Gregory. The family had not disappeared voluntarily. They had died inside that home. But the forensic reports revealed something else too. A 6th DNA profile. An unknown contributor whose blood had been found both inside the chalet and inside the abandoned Toyota Land Cruiser discovered near Geneva Airport. Suddenly, investigators knew they weren't just looking for bodies anymore. They were looking for whoever had been inside that house during the killings. French media quickly became obsessed with what newspapers began calling La Sixième Trace, the 6th trace. The mystery DNA profile dominated headlines across the country. Who did it belong to? An accomplice? A witness? Another victim? Or the killer himself? By this stage, the investigation had exploded in scale. Nearly 80 members of the French police force were now involved in the case. Helicopters continued searching remote caves, rivers, and mountain terrain, while sniffer dogs combed through forests surrounding the village. Still, no bodies were found. Investigators then began the painstaking process of collecting DNA samples from people connected to the Flactifs. Family members were tested first, followed by neighbors, business associates, former employees, and anyone else who may have crossed paths with Xavier. More than 300 people voluntarily provided saliva samples. Everyone cooperated. Everyone except one man, 31-year-old David Hotyet, a local mechanic, a neighbor of the Flactifs, and a man who openly despised Xavier. David and his partner, Alexandra Lefebvre, rented one of Xavier's chalets, and neither of them made any effort to hide their bitterness toward him. In fact, shortly after the family vanished, the couple had appeared on French television, where they openly criticized Xavier and spoke negatively about the family. But during one interview, David made a comment that immediately caught investigators' attention. Referring to the chalet, he casually remarked, "There may have been carnage in there." The problem was, he said this before police had publicly revealed any evidence of violence. At that point, investigators hadn't even announced the discovery of blood inside the home, so how did David know? Behind the scenes, detectives had already started paying close attention to him. Weeks earlier, they had wiretapped his phone and overheard conversations between David and Alexandra discussing the DNA testing campaign. David repeatedly insisted he was going to refuse providing a sample. His behavior only became more suspicious from there. Neighbors reported seeing him watching the forensic teams through binoculars, monitoring activity around the chalet almost obsessively as police continued their searches. Eventually, investigators confronted him directly. They warned David that refusing a DNA sample would only make him appear more guilty. Reluctantly, he gave in. 48 hours later, the lab results came back. It was a match. David Hotyacht was the owner of the infamous sixth trace. At last, investigators had their prime suspect. But they still weren't ready to arrest him. Police strongly suspected Alexandra had been involved too, so instead of moving immediately, they continued wiretapping the couple's phones, quietly listening and waiting for mistakes. Then, on August 14th, 2003, 4 months after the Flactif family disappeared, investigators intercepted a conversation that chilled them. Alexandra told David she hadn't felt right since April. David paused before asking carefully, "What happened in April?" There was a silence. Then Alexandra replied, "We should be careful. Our lives could be ruined all of a sudden." Over the following weeks, more intercepted calls pointed investigators toward another local couple, Stefan and Isabel Haremza, who police believed may have helped cover up the murders. David and Alexandra seemed increasingly nervous that the others might talk, that they might not stay quiet forever. By September 16th, investigators believed they finally had enough. That morning, police stopped David Hotyacht on his way to work, pulled him from his vehicle, and arrested him for murder. At the same time, officers raided his home and arrested Alexandra. Their 2 young children were taken into protective custody. Hours later, Stefan and Isabel were arrested as well, accused of helping conceal the crime. Faced with overwhelming forensic evidence, David Hotyacht broke quickly. Within 30 minutes of questioning, he confessed. According to David, panic took over almost immediately after Xavier was shot. He claimed he realized the rest of the family had either witnessed what happened or would soon discover the body, so he made a horrifying decision. One by one, he shot each remaining member of the Flactif family: Ghislaine, Sarah, Letitia, and little Gregory. Afterward, David said he wrapped their bodies in bed sheets taken from upstairs, carried them out to the family's red Toyota Land Cruiser, and began trying to erase every trace of what he had done. He scrubbed the chalet from top to bottom. He gathered petrol cans. Then he drove roughly 10 kilometers into the woods near the village of Thones. There, according to his confession, he burned all 5 bodies in an attempt to destroy the evidence before abandoning the Toyota at Geneva Airport, to make it appear as though the family had fled the country voluntarily. And throughout all of it, David insisted on one thing: he acted alone. Investigators struggled to believe what they were hearing. An entire family, including 3 children, wiped out over a relatively small debt. It seemed almost impossible to comprehend. But there was another problem too. The confession didn't feel right. When detectives separately questioned Alexandra and the Haremza couple, their stories mirrored David's almost perfectly. The wording, the timeline, even the explanations sounded strangely identical, as though the group had rehearsed their version of events beforehand. And then there was the issue of the fire. David eventually led investigators deep into the forest near Thoms, guiding them to the site where he claimed he had cremated the bodies. By the time police arrived there, nearly 5 months had passed since the murders. Very little remained. Among the ash and debris, investigators recovered fragments of bone, a few teeth, and the metal frame from Sarah's glasses. David claimed the bodies had burned completely within roughly 3 hours, but forensic experts immediately doubted that timeline. To test his story, investigators conducted a grim reconstruction experiment using pig carcasses, which are commonly used in forensic testing because of their similarity to human tissue. After 3 hours of burning, the carcasses were only around 20% cremated. Experts concluded that fully destroying 5 human bodies would have required an enormous sustained fire, something carefully planned in advance. Investigators estimated it would have taken nearly 800 kilograms of wood and a blaze burning continuously for close to 2 full days. This wasn't some impulsive attempt to hide evidence after a sudden accident. A fire pit would have needed preparation beforehand, fuel, materials, time, planning. And once investigators began looking at the logistics of the crime itself, David's claim that he acted alone started falling apart completely. 5 bodies, 1 man, transporting them through mountainous terrain, dragging them into the woods, maintaining a massive fire for nearly 48 hours, then returning to the chalet and cleaning it so meticulously that only advanced forensic chemicals could reveal the blood left behind. Investigators no longer believed this had been a spontaneous argument that spiraled out of control. This looked like premeditated murder, and it looked organized. With the forensic evidence mounting, the accomplices slowly began turning on one another. As pressure intensified, pieces of the real story finally started emerging, and what investigators uncovered was darker than anyone had originally imagined. As it turned out, David Hatiat and Xavier Flactif had once been friends. Both men came from northern France. Both had modest beginnings, but over the years their lives had gone in completely different directions. While Xavier appeared to build wealth effortlessly, David struggled constantly to stay afloat financially. At first, David admired Xavier's success, but admiration gradually curdled into resentment, and resentment eventually became obsession. David and Alexandra fixated on the Flactif's lifestyle, the luxury vehicles, the expensive chalet, the ski holidays, the designer clothes, the image of success they projected to the outside world. Everything the Flactifs had became a reminder of everything David felt he lacked. And according to investigators, they weren't the only ones who had grown bitter towards Xavier. Another northern French couple living in the area, Stéphane and Isabelle Haremza, had also moved to Le Grand Bornand, chasing the same alpine dream Xavier seemed to embody so effortlessly. Like David and Alexandra, Stéphane and Isabelle Haremza eventually became deeply disillusioned with Xavier Flactif. What began as shared frustration slowly evolved into something darker, binding the four together through a growing resentment toward the wealthy developer they once admired. At first, it was just gossip, complaints exchanged over drinks, mocking comments about Xavier's ego and flashy lifestyle, jokes about how satisfying it would be to see him humbled. But over time, those conversations stopped sounding harmless. The resentment became obsessive. According to investigators, the group began actively targeting Xavier and his family long before the murders ever happened. There was graffiti sprayed on his properties, fuel siphoned from his vehicles, acts of vandalism. Eventually, the harassment escalated into arson when David and Stéphane allegedly set fire to one of Xavier's chalets that was still under construction. The hatred had already crossed a line. Then, according to Alexandra, everything became even more disturbing in early 2003 after David watched a documentary about Italian serial killer Alfredo Stranieri, a man who murdered victims to steal their property and possessions. Something about the documentary seemed to deeply affect him. Afterward, David allegedly became fixated on the idea of making the Flactif family disappear entirely. At one point, Alexandra claimed he said, "Stranieri was an idiot. He got caught because he buried the bodies. They won't find anything at my place, because I'll burn them." Investigators would later conclude that the murders had not been spontaneous at all. They had been planned for months. In fact, according to Stefan Haremza, the original murder date was supposed to be April 9th, 2003, 2 days before the killings actually took place. The plan itself was horrifying. Stefan allegedly intended to strangle the children with rope, while David would shoot Xavier and Ghislaine using a pistol. But when the two men arrived at the chalet that night, Stefan lost his nerve. He couldn't do it. An argument reportedly broke out between the men, with David accusing him of being weak and cowardly before abandoning the plan altogether, but only temporarily. The murders were rescheduled for April 11th, and this time, David went alone. Using advanced blood spatter analysis, forensic reconstruction technology, and statements from the accomplices themselves, investigators were eventually able to piece together a chilling timeline of the Flactif family's final moments. The children arrived home from school shortly after 5:10 p.m. Phone records later confirmed they were still alive at 5:29, but not for much longer. Investigators believe David entered the chalet soon afterward, likely through an unlocked door. Inside the kitchen, 7-year-old Gregory and 10-year-old Sarah were having a snack at the dining table. Gregory was the first to die. Contrary to David's original confession, forensic evidence later showed the children had not been shot. Blood spatter patterns and microscopic fragments of Gregory's teeth embedded in the flooring indicated he had been beaten to death with a blunt object, likely a heavy piece of firewood. Investigators believe the weapon was later burned in the fireplace to destroy evidence. Sarah witnessed the attack on her younger brother. She tried to run. Forensic analysts determined she attempted to flee toward the front entrance before David caught her near the doorway. Blood projected across the wall at head height revealed the violence of the assault that followed. She too was bludgeoned to death. David then moved upstairs. There, 9-year-old Letitia had apparently hidden behind her sister's bed after hearing screams from below. Investigators believe she remained there silently, terrified, until David found her. She died from repeated blows from the same weapon. Meanwhile, Ghislaine had been downstairs in the basement laundry room. Investigators believe the sound of the washing machine may have prevented her from hearing the attacks upstairs. She was killed on the staircase as she came back toward the main floor. Blood spatter patterns indicated repeated trauma to the face and head, while drag marks later found on the stairs suggested David pulled her body back down toward the basement afterward. Investigators would later say there was at least one small mercy in the horror of that evening. Ghislaine likely died without ever fully understanding what had happened to her children. Xavier arrived home at approximately 6:45 p.m., a timeline confirmed through phone records. According to investigators, he walked into a nightmare. The bodies of his family were scattered throughout the chalet. Unlike the others, Xavier was shot with the pistol. Gunshot residue recovered from nearby curtains and furniture supported the theory that David used the firearm because he believed Xavier would physically fight back. And perhaps he did. According to testimony later given by Stefan Haremza, the murders were only the beginning. Over the next 2 days, David and his accomplices allegedly worked together to conceal the crime. They built and maintained the massive fire in the forest near Thones, feeding it continuously as the bodies burned. The murder weapon, a pistol belonging to one of Alexandra's relatives, was eventually sent to David's brother in northern France, with instructions to dispose of it. Police later recovered the gun from a river. Meanwhile, the accomplices cleaned the chalet, removed evidence, and carefully staged the scene to support the theory that the Flactif family had voluntarily fled the country. David even drove the family's Toyota Land Cruiser to Geneva Airport himself before taking a train back to Le Grand Bornand. For a while, the deception worked, but then David changed his story yet again. Just 1 month after confessing, he suddenly retracted everything. Now he claimed that when he arrived at the chalet on April 11th, the family was already dead. According to this new version of events, 2 unknown men had murdered the Flactifs before forcing David, under threat, to help dispose of the bodies and clean the crime scene. It was a dramatic reversal, one investigators didn't believe for a second. David's new version of events collapsed almost immediately under the sheer weight of evidence against him. Forensic findings contradicted his story. Phone records contradicted his story. Witness testimony contradicted his story. And yet, despite all of it, David continued insisting that unknown men were responsible for the murders right up until trial. As the investigation moved toward court proceedings, multiple psychological evaluations were conducted on David Hatyat. The reports painted the picture of a deeply manipulative and emotionally detached man. Psychiatrists described him as narcissistic, controlling, and incapable of accepting responsibility for his actions. They noted his remarkable ability to compartmentalize emotion, to separate himself psychologically from the horror of what he had done. At times, David attempted to portray himself as mentally impaired during the killings, suggesting he had acted in some kind of dissociative state. But psychiatrists found no evidence of any disorder severe enough to reduce his criminal responsibility. Their conclusion was blunt. David Hatyat understood exactly what he was doing. The trial finally began on June 12, 2006, more than 3 years after the Flactif family vanished from their chalet in Le Grand Bornand. For 3 weeks, France became captivated by the case. Every detail was dissected in newspapers and on television. The brutality of the murders, the attempted cover-up, the jealousy simmering beneath the surface of a quiet alpine village, it all felt almost impossible to comprehend. And during the proceedings, another uncomfortable reality emerged. Witnesses testified that Xavier and his family had faced significant hostility while living in the village. Some residents openly resented them, while others reportedly directed racist abuse toward the family over the years. At one stage, speculation grew that the murders may have been partially motivated by xenophobia or racial hatred, but prosecutors ultimately maintained that the driving motive was greed, resentment, and envy, rather than ideology. According to the prosecution, David and the others had become consumed by bitterness toward the life the Flactifs appeared to have built, and prosecutors reserved particular criticism for Alexandra Lefebvre. They described her as the person who blew on the embers and cleaned the ashes, someone who encouraged David's obsession, fueled the hatred, and helped orchestrate the cover-up afterward. When the trial finally came to an end, the sentences were severe. David Hatyat received life imprisonment with a minimum term of 22 years. Alexandra Lefebvre was sentenced to 10 years. Stefan Haremza received 15 years. Isabel Haremza received 7. And David's brother Mikhail Hatyat, who disposed of the murder weapon, received a suspended sentence with probation. David initially appealed his conviction, but on the very first day of the new proceedings, he unexpectedly withdrew the appeal altogether. Today, most of David's accomplices have already served their sentences and been released. David Hatyat himself, now in his 50s, reportedly displayed exemplary behavior while incarcerated and became eligible for parole consideration in 2025, but was thankfully not released. But even decades later, the Flactif family murders remain one of the most disturbing cases in modern French criminal history. Not only because of the brutality, but because of the motive behind it all. An entire family, including 3 children, was annihilated, not for revenge, not for survival, but out of jealousy. David and the others envied the Flactif success. The chalet, the cars, the lifestyle, the image of happiness, and when they felt they could never have those things themselves, they chose to destroy the people who did. Le Grand Bornand, once known as a peaceful alpine village, surrounded by postcard-perfect mountains, became forever linked to one of France's darkest family massacres. Some residents eventually moved away. Others refused to speak about the case at all. And the chalet where the Flactif family died still stands today, overlooking the village in silence, a reminder of what happened there. Mario Blanc, Ghislaine's surviving son, was one of the only immediate family members left behind after the murders, and he has spent the rest of his life carrying the unimaginable weight of surviving when the others did not. The endless what-ifs, the guilt, the knowledge that he was only hours away from sharing the same fate as his mother, sisters, and little brother. Sadly, though, cases where only one member survives a family massacre are not unique to the Flactif family.